Hi, I'm Pastor Andrew Fitch, Mount Zion Lutheran Church in Lewisberry, and with me today is my son Ryan. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
I'm a final year Seminarian student. I'm serving my internship right now in a little town called Shakora, PA, in the southwestern PA Synod, so about 3.5 hours away.
Excellent. Thanks for joining me as we talk about the text
Yeah.
while we're in this quarantine situation. So here we are. We're using the Narrative Lectionary, so we had to talk about it a little bit because your congregation is in the.
We're using revised lectionary, so we're using different texts, but
Yeah.
that's okay. We're in the Gospel of Luke most of the year, but right now in Lent we're in the Gospel of John. So
Cool. Well, thanks for talking this out with me because I decided that as a preacher, just preaching to an empty screen with no audience would have been really tough for me. I really like that feedback. So,
Mhm.
so we're going to kind of chat about the text. I'm going to read it for you. Our text for this Sunday is from Mark chapter 2, and I'm reading to you from the New Revised Standard Version. And Jesus began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. And then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them, and one of them beat over the head and insulted. And he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally he sent him to them, saying, They will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and this was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. Then they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he had said. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it. And they brought one. And then he said to them, Whose head is this, and whose title? And they answered, The emperor's. And Jesus said to them, Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were utterly amazed at him. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, yeah, it's another one of those warm and fuzzy stories with Jesus, isn't it?
Mhm.
Really kind of tough parable, to be honest. A man planted a vineyard. Might be a reasonable title, but the brutality and the violence in it certainly is one that you're going to have a hard time really dealing with. I mean, especially if you're sharing this story with kids.
Yeah.
Anything strike you as I just read through it?
I mean, there's a lot of things that definitely stand out to me. Before we continue, though, I think you might have said that we were in the second chapter of Mark, but we're in chapter 12, just a few chapters later.
Just a few.
If you're following along, chapter 12. Yeah, so there's a couple of things that stand out to me. I think from the start, and this is a particularly important area of study for me, is the agricultural lens of the parables. And this one specifically, but in many others, Jesus is also talking about and giving metaphorical language within the context of a farm, a vineyard, a field, etc. Even doing ministry with the fig tree a couple of verses earlier. And And so this is an interesting. Every time a parable comes up, I think it's important to point out that this vineyard, although we imagine it as a place that is highly controlled and organized, ultimately you could say in the realm of these parables is always the space that belongs to God as creation.
Right.
This is something that the author Ellen Davis brings out a whole bunch in her book that's called Scripture, Culture, Agriculture.
Yeah.
That you kind of can't unread the Bible once you read it from a growing agricultural sort of lens. And it's important. This life of being in relationship with the land, the people, the other creatures around is vital to the ethics, you could say, that were developed when the Israelites were in the desert, in the wilderness. They had nothing, so they had to rely on God to create all of their rules, their provisions, everything. And so we see this then, I think, spinning out into all of the parables that Jesus is preaching, because this is the world that he's grown up in. It's highly agricultural, but then their rules for life are developed, you could say, in the dirt. And I think, before we even get to the thread of the son here, the beloved son.
Right. Gee, I wonder who that could be.
Yeah. Before we get there, though, I think it might be important to point out this connection of violence and blood being spilled upon the land, calling us back to, and there aren't any notes in here, but I would be curious if this weren't to connect the reader back to Cain and Abel and the blood being soaked into the land, and then the land is groaning in pain for the loss of that relationship. And here again, we hear over and over again that somebody comes to this vineyard, is treated horribly and killed. And although it doesn't say in here, but I think we can imagine that their blood is spilled on this vineyard. Which then as I'm processing this, might ultimately connect to our sacramental language. But maybe I'll stop there. There's a lot of layers.
No, that's a really, really good connection. I mean, many times when we're interpreting parables, we try to figure out who's who, and we don't pay attention to the whole entire meaning, which is like multiple meanings.
Right.
And I think this is really true in this case, because when you first read this parable, it seems like 100% allegorical, and it's really not. It's not that clear. And like you, I had a similar response of kind of thinking about, well, why did the man plant a vineyard? Now, some scholars like to point to Isaiah,
right?
Isaiah 5, right, which has two verses which the words almost line up, with a very similar kind of meter, measure, and meaning with the Mark text.
Do you want me to read any of that?
You could read those two. It's like verses 1 and 2, I think, right?
I think so. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He planted a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat, a wine pit, in it, and he expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded no grapes.
Yeah. So you can definitely you can feel that maybe it was just pulled from that, and at least in some form when Jesus was sharing this parable. But for me, I was also thinking, why a vineyard? We have other stories, and there are certainly lots of other crops in the Holy Land.
Yeah.
So, in terms of drinks in Middle Eastern time, the way I understand it is the water was not usually great to drink.
No.
So one of the main beverages of choice was
wine.
Yeah. And a little bit of a modern connection for me too was that there's a lot of physical labor described in this text in terms of preparing the vineyard, making sure that it will function and work properly. But it was also, organic gardening. I mean, there were no chemicals. There was very limited hybridization.
No, yeah.
So it was all just work, the back of your the muscles of your back,
Right.
the strength of your arms, the laborers that you would employ. So I think the physicality of
Yeah.
working in creation for that which would yield fruit is something that I think we also might miss about this.
Right. And it's communal too. This is a big part of eco theology, is that there are many relationships involved just in the thread of a vineyard. You have workers, you have an owner, you have, the one who comes and plants, and then you have the lineage of the family to care for that land. Um, but then ultimately, I think it becomes a reliance on, and this would have been vital to them because they wouldn't have necessarily understood the fertility of a land beyond it yielding fruit.
Yeah.
And so one needed to rely on God for it to showcase its fruitfulness, for it to be sustaining. But I also think when you have all of those things together, you have kind of a happy people, happy land, and happy
Right.
God.
Right.
And in here, that's not the case with the parable, right? You have unhappy people who are breaking relationships, and then ultimately throwing the owner out of the vineyard, right?
Yeah.
Which again, I can't imagine doesn't call us back to Adam and Eve being thrown out of the garden.
Yeah.
Because they also have broken relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works. It works better, honestly, in terms of kind of trying to throw each other out of the vineyard than it does trying to throw God out of the vineyard.
Yeah.
Um, some people would obviously equate, the killing of the beloved son. And I'm not saying that that's not a piece of the meaning, but I think
Right.
another piece of the meaning is that whole context of you can't kill God.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of inherent in this text, because they're thinking that they can become owners of the vineyard,
right?
And some
and
scholars,
owners of the inheritance,
owners of the inheritance,
name of that land,
right? Because apparently there were laws that if your owner of the vineyard that you worked became an absentee owner, and didn't show up for harvest time, you could presume that it was your vineyard. And so there's that whole, like, we're going to kill anybody that comes because eventually it'll just be ours. Because obviously the owner is maybe no longer dead, so the other people are trying to come to collect what should have been collected by the owner. So they're thinking the owner's dead. It's like the reading of the will.
Yeah.
They've read the will, and all these other people are coming, so we can take it for ourselves.
Yeah. Which is interesting because, as I was first reading this, and we haven't gotten to this part yet, but I really was struggling to see any connection to the second half of this, talking about taxes and Caesar and stuff. But as you're describing this, it makes me realize that Jesus then ramps this example up.
Yeah. Who owns it?
Who owns the land?
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, it's not Caesar's. It's not the vineyard owners. It's not the people seeking to disrupt the order. It is God's land. It is God's own work.
Yeah.
To be beloved, to be cherished. Yeah. And that's a really interesting. So I hadn't thought about that yet.
Yeah, and let's not forget that the big exclamation point on this whole text is give to God.
Right.
Out of everything that's God's.
Right.
This isn't even a tithe. This is just give to God everything that's God's.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you might have a subsequent question of, well, what is not God's? I mean, for people of faith,
sure,
we're saying, well, isn't everything God's?
Yeah.
Doesn't really help us decide maybe in terms of our giving percentage because it's just 100%.
Right.
But it certainly helps us to pay attention to everything around us.
Yeah.
Belonging to God.
Right. And subscribing the invaluable relationship of that createdness belonging to God, what it's due, rather than what we think it's due.
Right. So creation becomes not something that's transactional.
Right.
Not something that we get stuff out of.
It's anti-transactional.
It's anti-transactional because we all belong to it.
Right.
We're all a part of it. And when we try to fight and steal and get ourselves into the right position of inheritance, we're actually trying to short circuit the reality,
Yeah.
which Jesus kind of, in a subsequent meaning of the text, tells us won't work.
Right.
Which, by the way, comically comes up in tax season. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting. Do you want to move on to that, or do you want to talk more about the vineyard?
Why don't we talk a little bit about the beloved son thread?
The beloved son.
We should probably touch on that.
Is it allegorical or not?
Yeah.
Might be
right.
The kind of thing there. So for me, when I interpret parables, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but for me, the number one rule is there's always more than one meaning for a parable. Mm-hmm. So I'm not always very comfortable doing an allegorical meaning for a parable.
But one single
allegorical meaning.
Right.
But for this parable, I have a really hard time, other than the kind of creation meaning.
Right.
I have a hard time not saying the beloved son is Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Because, and I think for me the big thing is context, right? When you look at this text, this is chapter 12, not 2. Right. Chapter 12, talk about a great start. Chapter 12 in Mark, and the Narrative Lectionary skipped over it because it wants to put it in the church year. Mm-hmm. Chapter 11, right. Which is Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
Yep.
So folks, this is happening during Holy Week. Mm-hmm. Okay? This is Jesus not giving a passion prediction anymore because he's like, I've passed the point of no return.
Right.
I know what's coming for me. I'm aware of my mission and I'm going to die. Mm-hmm. And so this becomes a passion parable.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't usually like saying a parable equals this.
Yeah.
But I think out of all the parables that Jesus teaches, I think this one's definitely about him and us.
Right.
And I think it does, however, frame that set of meanings within our createdness. Mm-hmm. And I think that also means that we have to look at the passion, crucifixion, and resurrection within the context of working to reconcile us not only to God but to creation.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think that the common atonement theories that are out there always want to focus on me and Jesus.
Right.
And this parable just does not let you do this.
No, it doesn't.
What else do you think about the beloved son?
Well, I think it's important to note too that phrase, the beloved son, is the way that Mark is almost always referring to Jesus. Mm-hmm. From the parent-child relationship of God and Jesus. Jesus is almost always the beloved son. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right to say it is difficult to think that could really be anybody else.
Yeah.
And also, thinking about Jesus' ministry at this point being very clearly oriented towards his death, I think really brings out the meaning of what Jesus is getting across by identifying himself as the beloved son.
Yeah.
Maybe at this point you could say Jesus really truly understands what God is calling his ministry to.
So I got a question for you. So do you think that's like the best title for Jesus?
The beloved son?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's the best. It's probably one of many though. I don't think I could say it would just be one. I also love I don't love a lot of John's gospel, but I do really appreciate the divine logos. Yeah. And Christ as the anointed one titles and but I think for Mark it probably is and maybe Luke as well.
But it's like I think you're really onto something here. It's really like the divine title ascribed to Jesus. Mm-hmm. Like Jesus will the title that he will ascribe to himself most commonly, I think, is the Son of Humanity or the Son of Man.
Right.
And I think the titles that people ascribe to him are usually, Son of God or Son of the Most High God.
Yeah.
The demons seem to also go towards that angle, but there's a different twist to the beloved son.
Right. There isn't one relationship there, is this the beloved Son of God? Yeah. Is this also the beloved Son of humanity? Absolutely. Is this also the beloved Son of all creation?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Uh-huh.
You have, I think, then the multi-layered meaning of the parable itself, but then also of Jesus' own title, that he may be referring to himself as, not as the one understanding,
but
but
that's cool though. I mean, beloved
yeah,
Son of the Vineyard.
right,
You know,
yeah,
you want another cool title for this parable? The beloved Son of the Vineyard.
right,
And if you want to connect other texts, you know, we are
yeah,
the branches,
absolutely,
you know, of Jesus the vine. You know, it's a little bit it's from John,
right, right,
but still that theology of the church of Jesus is definitely there. You know, we're not just the body of Christ just in terms of being connected to Christ, but as part of Jesus's creation.
yeah,
You know, the vineyard is a great image, and I think I don't think I said it earlier. I wanted to, but you were on a really good point. So I didn't interrupt. But
sure,
I remembered a worship theologian, and I wish I could remember who said it, but it's for no insignificant reason that bread and wine
yeah,
are the elements of the sacrament of the altar. It's because you can't just make them by yourself.
Oh yeah,
You know, you
that's
have
a
to
really
have
good
people,
point.
you have to have creation,
Yeah,
you have to have all that God is involved in
right.
to bring that together into the sacrament.
And also, to get into some of the details of that, maybe unnecessarily, but they wouldn't have understood yeast at the time,
No.
and so there was surely an element of mystery to both of those physical elements. How does the bread get so airy? How does the wine become alcoholic? They would not have known. It would just bubble with this, mysterious thing, which is such, I think, a really important part of, that there is community involved in the shaping of this thing,
Right.
but then there is also something else.
Yeah.
That we know now is yeast, but I think that element of mystery could be lost sometimes.
Yeah, and they definitely didn't know what yeast looked like under a microscope, but
right.
we do
Right.
have guesses that they knew what it meant to make a fast cake, and they knew what it meant to, you know, let a loaf ferment.
Right.
Proof.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's a cool connection.
Absolutely, I agree.
Maybe we should say a little bit about the emperor's coin.
Yeah,
trick.
probably just briefly.
So just in case you didn't recognize what was going on there, they were trying to trick Jesus, and Jesus tricked them. You know, so he didn't have the coin in his pocket. Yeah. He said, "Fetch me a coin."
Right.
And then I'll talk to you.
Right.
They produced it.
If you're reading along, this is down in about 1516.
Right. So they have the coin, they bring it and show it, which means they have it in their hands.
Right.
So Jesus is automatically, just by that little kind of show of the coin, innocent of carrying it with him. Which, why would it be a problem to carry that with you?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into some of, I think, Luther's theology and understanding of the Ten Commandments too. That, the first commandment is you are to have no other gods. And what you hear on the inscription of that coin is that Caesar is the divine, that people are asserting themselves to each and every time they possess that coin and also trade with that coin. And so what Jesus is saying to them is Caesar your God? Or is the God of Israel, the God who is claiming me as the beloved Son, is that your God? And Luther says, that assertion of saying you will have no other gods is so hard for us to do because we subscribe the godliness to so many different things, whether that's money now or anything really that can distract us from God, whether that's a car or even family sometimes can be that distraction, or I don't know. Luther lists a bunch of really good examples. Money, I think, being pretty high on his list.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's partly because it comes out in in the dynamics of texts like this, that Jesus is saying the divine that you have on this piece of money is not the divinity that you should be asserting all of your trust in.
Yeah.
All of your faith in.
Yeah. So they were trying to trap him in the tax question, whether they should pay taxes or not, because a lot of people hated paying taxes, still true today.
Right.
But what Jesus wound up saying was, who is your God?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So then they're left with that question of, oh, yeah, we're part of the empire just because we have these coins and we know that we have to pay the taxes. Come on, it's kind of a dumb question. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to not pay taxes and then the soldiers will be, we've got you have your taxes or you're dead. I mean,
right.
There weren't really very many options. You either paid them or you were punished.
Yeah.
Maybe if you were a good citizen, you could be put in jail. Maybe. But the Romans weren't really known for playing nice and easy with people that didn't pay their taxes.
No, especially in this area.
And the fact that it was Pharisees and Herodians. Herodians were the ones that were definitely in favor of Jewish cooperation with Roman authority.
Oh, absolutely.
Jesus was aware of this and was totally putting them on notice by saying, if you're going to live in part of the empire, and if you're going to, be okay with the rules of the empire, you have to abide by the empire.
Yeah.
Somehow Jesus was managing to live outside of the empire.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the way it comes off as seeing. He didn't have the coin.
Right.
Did he just always live off of the generosity of others? You didn't.
Maybe. That's interesting.
You didn't have to. I heard this earlier this week in a podcast, and I didn't really even think about it that way. I always just thought Jesus just didn't have one with him.
Mm-hmm.
But it was possible to live a very self-sustaining life that if you weren't really trading in income, if you weren't really amassing a wealth,
right,
if you weren't really gaining in, those types of things that could be taxed, you didn't have to submit a tax. They didn't have taxes for people that were just breathing. Yeah. You had to be a part of the economy.
Right.
So without getting too heavy into that, again, I think the power of the exclamation point on this whole thing is give to God the things that are God's.
Right. Yeah. I would agree.
Any last words?
No. It's just always fun to look at parables because they are so dense, right? But yeah, I do think there's a lot to the relational aspect of this too, to really consider the fact that the workings of a vineyard, the workings of God's kingdom depend on relationships between other humans, between other creatures of God, and are exemplified in the relationship of the beloved Son, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point. And it gets disrupted by economics and by Caesar being number one at
taxes.
This time, for sure.
Fighting over wealth.
Right.
Fighting over the inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, a summary of these multiple meanings might be that relationships are significant to God.
Yeah.
Our relationship with God is significant. But that set of relationships and consideration and love is set within this harmony and unity with creation.
Mm-hmm.
And we are 100% a part of the package that it has the big stamp of God, this belongs to me.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to take care of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess one of the other interesting takeaways could be, what part of the vineyard are we working?
Mm-hmm.
How are we working in the vineyard? That could certainly be a spin-off question.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for watching us, checking in today. Hopefully, if we can keep our quarantine act together, we'll have more of these postings, maybe by audio, because he's going to go out to Western PA and I'm going to be quarantined here. So, love and peace in the name of Christ. Bye-bye.
Take care.